Hello everyone, I am not a designer. I am an artist and an educator. I've been deeply interested in how people learn for the last 20 years. And I think that I'm going to be bringing that perspective into our conversation today. I think that I appreciate your question about slowness and fastness, and I'm really interested from hearing everybody today to think about, so many of these projects have so many similarities, even though they're in India or in Shanghai or in Europe. What are the differences and what are the subtle nuances that allow us to learn from each other? So that's where I hope the questions will go when we move forward. Which direction? Yeah.
The green one, the green.
Yeah, I am pressing the green light.
No.
Yeah, there we go. Okay. I'm going to be sharing the work of many students and artists, and they're kind of mentioned here. And I want to start by saying that Bangalore is a city that I grew up in, and over the last 15 years, it has exploded 300% from what it was. This is different from the stories we've been hearing from Europe, similar to the stories we're hearing in Shanghai, and we're kind of caught in the middle. And this desire to be a world-class city is a driving force for the government. And what's happening is huge conflicts between a government agenda and citizens on the ground. And I wouldn't say not all conflict, but what has emerged from there is a lot of citizen activism, both good and bad, or complex, and I will talk a little bit about it. But 8 years ago, I walked into the metro office. This was a new metro system that is being built in the city of Bangalore. So you're creating a new mass transit system that's desperately needed, but on a city that's old. So what happens with environmental damage, what happens with displacement of people and communities, what happens with politics and power when people get to move a line from here to there so that it doesn't go through my house because I have money. These are all the complexities of a city going through this process, and any city that has gone through this process will know that. Now, what happened was that Bangalore is known as it was known many years ago as the Garden City of India. It is no more that. It has been known as the garbage city. It has been known as the tech city now. It is also, I think that one of the biggest pain points is the idea of loss, the loss of a city that people knew. And when I walked into the metro office 8 years ago, I wanted to engage in a conversation with folks there and saying, how can artists and designers be in conversation with the city? This is very different from where you're coming from in Europe and the stories that we've heard, because this is almost a beginning conversation in some ways and very slow. So I share this picture because it's a student experiment, and he is experimenting with the nature of participation at the metro station. And he has magnetic poetry words all along the pillars here that people are writing poems. But when he first started, he had words that were in English, Kannada, Hindi, Bengali, Bihari, in many languages. And over the week that he was running this experiment, all the other languages, the words were pulled off and taken away by people, and only English remained. And we were shocked. What makes English so benign that it can remain while all of the other languages were removed? What is the story here? And what is it emblematic of? Bangalore is one of the cities with the most amount of migration in India. People from all over the world are coming in because of technology centers, and people from all over the country are coming in to work in these technology centers at the upper level or support the construction industry at the lower level. So you're dealing with a city that has always been known for migration, but in a very slow way. Suddenly, the pace of migration has increased and the fear of loss of identity along with it. So in this context, okay, I need to figure out where I'm. Yeah. Oh, there we go. Okay, thank you. I, as an educator, bring my inquiry into this space. I am working with undergraduate students primarily, and I also work with, outside of Srishti, with migrant youth that have dropped out of the government school system for a variety of reasons. And I'm interested in what relationship these young people develop with place, and what are the factors that affect this relationship, and what influences their agency to act critically and creatively in their place. We're talking here about social innovation at a systemic level, and as a design school, we're working with individuals that have come from all over the country and all over the world to a private school. We were talking about the dynamics of being elite in an environment that you're working in. What are the challenges of place-based work, and how do we develop this relationship with place? We're talking about a time of incredible transience and very fast change, climate change, migration, environmental degradation, local versus global economies. These are the tensions that are there, and so this research question for myself is something that has been reiterated over and over and over again in many of the conversations that we've had today. I think that the work, Srishti in itself, as some of the examples that you've just heard, has many centers and labs that work in the social space, and has many centers and labs that work directly with the city. So these are just a list of some of them that work directly with the city. Blank Noise works on dynamics of gender in public space. Art Science Lab, very much similar to looking at DIY science in the public sphere. The Kabir Project, as many of you may have heard of, is looking at language and poetry and the ideas of dissonance and otherness that we engage with. Now, with all of these projects, with Srishti, we have our education and research on the inside, and this practice that works as a threshold space that engages with the city. And the project that I'm going to be sharing today is called the Art and Transit Lab. The metro that we've been collaborating with now for the last 4 years, I walked into their office 8 years ago. They refused to work with us because they thought of us as artists and designers as a bunch of activists. You're going to create problems for us. We don't want to work with you. And it took us 4 years to convince them, because we started working with other city organizations around waste management, for them to be able to see that there are ways that artists can work with city partners. And so after 4 years of convincing, we started a lab at the station, but this is what they wanted. They wanted the Moscow station in Bangalore. That's what they wanted. And we said, that's not something that we're going to do, but yes, we'll start. So what we did was we moved our studios into the stations, and now we work across 8 stations, 5 temporary short-term projects, and 3 long-term projects that are across the stations. Actually, is there a way to go back to that slide? Yeah. I think that we've talked about this in many of the presentations, but coming as an artist and working with designers and working with educators and social scientists, I think that these interdisciplinary labs are really important. Somebody brought that up today. How do we as educators have our first kind of focus to the student, and then develop these collaborative platforms within the city space? What allows for a 20-year-old to play the whole game, take something all the way through, all the way to a government level? Is that something that, how do we support that? We're talking about process and prototyping. How do we allow the city to see the value of prototyping? That's been one of the hardest things. They want the Moscow metro, but how do you allow for prototyping? How do you allow for process to be made visible instead of just product? How does the education of one group of people allow for the city to be transformed in that way? And then how do we sustain long-term partnerships in that way? Here, a student is presenting their prototype to the metro officials and then works with the engineers to implement whatever the projects that they're developing. Why the metro? Within the city of Bangalore, the city was known for its neighborhoods, not anymore. You go to one neighborhood, it looks like the other neighborhood. There's no place-based identity anymore. So our work has really been about rebuilding place-based dynamics within a space. Many of the projects have mentioned that. So each station is situated and it's distinct. But as an educator, the metro is an extremely interesting place because it is a place of contradictions. It is a symbol of a changing city, and it brings in the right contradictions of environmental damage and displacement of communities, change of economic dynamics based on where a metro station is located, and on the other hand, it's a desperately needed public transit system. So all of these right contradictions allow for great learning to happen within a space like this. India and Bangalore in particular, I think like many of the other mega cities, is desiring to be this world-class city, and it's a scary desire for many of us who are on the ground. But this idea of worlding, if we can disassociate Bangalore's desire to be like Singapore, or Bangalore's desire to be like Shanghai, or wherever else in the world, what it allows for emergence that we've been talking about here is the opportunity, where we're not thinking about it in the old ways of the disenfranchised versus those in power, but looking at what are these small models of emergence that come up. Being an educator, I am really interested in the dynamics of what's going on in the young people that come to learn with us. The gentrification of the mind is so strong as we develop a desire for a certain kind of westernized future in Bangalore City. And it is pervasive both from the government level as well as in my resident welfare association, where most people work at a corporate campus and want that in their neighborhood. So how then, as an educator, do we counter the gentrification of the mind that happens? And when we're talking about infrastructure projects within a city, they are definitely the dynamics of power. So what allows us to think critically about those dynamics of power as we're working with it? All of the photographs that I'm sharing are at a station or in the immediate community around it. And these are prototype students working on the platform. Now, many people have spoken about unused spaces. The metro stations that were built were huge because they hoped that they would be like malls. But that didn't quite work. And so we have been lucky because we've got many of these large spaces at the metro station because they didn't manifest to be malls as yet. And so we've used these spaces to be our studios. Many student projects are installations that are, again, design interventions because it's an infographic of different information about a certain area, or creating pop-up reading spaces in partnership with local bookstores, some product design work where Bangalore is just experiencing the underground for the first time in a new city because we are on a bed of granite. And so our experience at the underground station is still very disorienting. And so here students are engaging with lighting design, because these are interdisciplinary studios. We have students from public space design, architecture, interiors, a whole range of different things, along with contemporary art students. Students developing public seating and creating different ways and formats of interaction. So for 2 years, we were just a studio for our students within the station, because we had to spend time convincing the metro of the kind of work and thinking that we were engaged with. After that, I would say that many of the pedagogical decisions we were making were very slow and deliberate in terms of both critical pedagogy, place-based pedagogy, public pedagogy, looking at affect and cognition as we engaged with participatory practices. But we realized that we had over a period of time developed a level of trust with the city and the metro, and we changed into being also, along with student courses and projects, also a platform for other resident welfare associations, social service organizations, all of them to partner with us. And we have now been running these projects or these events called the Festival of Stories that are now, we just finished our 8th Festival of Stories in October. Now, I want to come back to this idea of value that was being spoken about, and how do we shift and rebuild value that is not just economic value. And we all, as people who are working in the area of social innovation, know the power of story to be able to bring about complexity of thinking, the ability to have different perspectives because you use the story, and the ability to rebuild cultural value because of the story. So the Festival of Stories has really been an attempt for us to bring a lot of traditional practices back into the contemporary art space, along with Bangalore being the tech city, of course, new digital practices as well. And it's become an umbrella, and we have worked with over 70 organizations over these 8 festivals, along with students and artists and all of that. Now, this may come across right now as just an socially engaged art project. And where does it make its way into social innovation? 2 of the biggest issues that we are engaging with right now is the dynamics of gender safety in public spaces. You all have read the newspapers over the last couple of years, and India has had a horrific series of rape and really the treatment of women within a country that is really engaging in very fast growth and modernization and struggling with the dynamics of that. The Metro just reinstated a women's only car in the Metro train. Now this may seem completely backwards to you, but it's not in India. It was made as a political move just before the elections, not because people necessarily wanted it. And so the work that we've started doing with the Metro, they didn't want it. The Metro themselves didn't want the women's only car. It was a political move from higher up that said, oh, we're going to do this just before the elections so that it becomes a way to clean our image as we start to support women within the public space. So in the way that we worked through a set of residencies with artists, with women artists, to engage with this issue, but then also started working with the Metro on this public campaign called Metro Mitra, which is really about working with women's organizations to create emergency buttons in public transit that allow for people to be able to signal if there is an issue. So we're trying to work both in the creative and artistic space, as well as now slowly start to work in the dynamics of where we're actually creating systems that will allow for change to happen. The other area that we're really in the thick of is the dynamics of migration, as I mentioned earlier. The Metro last year was made to remove their signs in Hindi, which is our national language, by the way, across all of the stations by a local Kannada group that said, Hindi is not our national language. We should only have the state language and English in all signage across the station. Now, this is a very specific move because the amount of migration that has happened from all across the country to Bangalore is primarily from the north. And this is a move to reject that migration, saying that we don't need for people to understand what's happening in the system. And this is a tussle that is, again, a political tussle. So, again, the way we've been working is to work in Kannada, so in the local language, so people who are not Kannadiga don't understand it, but use poetry as a way for people to start to think differently within the language cultures. What we've also done is created a platform for students and artists across the city to create silent comics about place, so that they are able to engage in place-based stories that anybody can understand. And through that has evolved a whole set of open markets that have now been taking place, where we've had about 6 open markets that allow for these silent comics and a comic book culture to start developing around place-based stories. So these are ways that certain problems have changed in all of these different ways. I've come to the end here, almost the end of my presentation, because and here I want to share the tensions that we continue to engage with in the work that we do. And hopefully this will come up in some of the questions. But the dynamics of activism and gentrification and the tensions between them. The dynamics of place and practice as people impose practice on place or place starts to dictate practice. The dynamics of local and global. We are so influenced by the West. How does it allow for us to even silence that, to be able to see what is emergent in our own contexts? The dynamics of ephemeral and archival practices. Some things that are temporary, or some things that allow and are systemic and can stay for longer. And the dynamics of value and impact. Who does this have value for? And what is the dynamics of impact? This is something that has already come up. In closing, we're right now working on many projects that are moving more to a systems design space. So I'll start with the center one. We just opened up what we call the Festival of Propositions, where people across the city could propose ideas for the metro, and we would help them facilitate this dynamic with the metro. So one of the projects, and this is in connection with your question about climate change, is looking at sensor data across the city that we set up at the metro stations to look at pollution data and work with the metro to create Save the Air days that allow for people free transit during that time frame based on pollution data. So this is one of the projects that we're working on. Another is a child-friendly cities project, looking at where kids actually start and can play on the street. So these are projects that are coming up from the Festival of Propositions, where other people, and these are not artists, not designers, anybody can propose a project, and through a jury process we select some projects that we can continue to work on. We're working on a project that is a collaborative project between San Francisco and Bangalore, and we're sister cities. And San Francisco has a huge force on the city of Bangalore that people don't even realize, because we're the back office in terms of Bangalore being Silicon Valley of San Francisco. And so we're collaborating with a whole set of artists there on dynamics of data privacy and using public performances to engage in that. And then within the stations that we are working at, we're developing a project that is across the country called the People Place Project, which allows this relationship of people to place to be rebuilt, and then creating publications around that. So I will end here, and thank you.